Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Jeff Thompson. I'm a research scientist with Columbia University in the Department of Psychiatry, and I want to welcome everybody to day 2 of our Resilience Symposium, where the theme for this year is In Awe of Space. Again, what we're trying to do here is take a different approach from these usual or typical webinars and Zoom sessions where the format for each session is the same, roughly 50 minutes. We have a space expert sharing the incredible knowledge that they know, how resilience awe sort of impacts their work. I jump in, I'll ask a couple of questions specifically related to resilience and awe. And then what I think is the unique approach then is this third part where we have Mitch Rudin here as well. Very successful people in different professions that have nothing to do with space, and they're going to share their key takeaways from in this case what Sandra shares with us, and then ask a question or two. Over 800 people registered for this symposium, 31 countries. The other thing I would just say really quickly too is I wear a different t-shirt for each session. It's not advertising, they're not paying me, they're just organizations that I really enjoy either working with or supporting. And today's I'm very proud to be wearing Reps for Responders. And it's a gentleman that's a police officer in the NYPD, and he does a lot of mental health and physical health for not just police, but all first responders and military veterans. On top of that, just him and his wife are just good-hearted people, and I'm very proud to be supporting them. At the very end, if people are still wondering, well, wait, what the hell is this concept of resilience and awe? We show a video at the very end for the recording for people that are interested to know a bit more on the science on that. Dr. Alexandra Whitmire, she is incredible. What does she do? She's a deputy element scientist for the Human Factors and Behavioral Performance Division at NASA. And
thanks, Jeff, for the very kind introduction. So as Jeff said, I'm Alexandra Whitmire, go by Sandra, and I get to work in the NASA Human Research Program in the Human Factors and Behavioral Performance Elements. And so thank you, by the way, for inviting me to participate in this and getting to share about the great work that we get to do. It's an honor and a blessing to be a part of it. So, so just some kind of obligatory introductory slides, which you may have seen a couple of these already, so my apologies if that's the case. But just to tell you a little bit about HRP, the program that we are in at NASA, our focus is really on buying down risk, ultimately for Mars. That has been our target for many years. And so we think about the level of support that is provided now to crews on ISS, and then we kind of compare that to the parameters that we're facing as we look to Mars. And so what are the gaps in knowledge and gaps in mitigation that we need to target to ensure the crew remains healthy and high performing through those missions? In recent years, we've been focusing more and more on lunar and on Artemis missions, both in thinking about what do we have now sort of in our research portfolio that could help mitigate the human health and performance risks during anticipated lunar missions, as well as how can we use research on the surface of the moon to help get us ready for Mars. And so within HRP, we kind of organize things by a certain framework. And a lot of times we talk about, all the stressors that the crew members experience now will experience in the future. And we've kind of bucketed that by hazards. And so the primary hazards that you see here are space radiation, isolation, confinement, distance from Earth, gravity or lack thereof, and hostile closed environments. And so we'll delve more into these in the coming slides. This is a total eyesore. I apologize for this chart. We love these kinds of charts at NASA, I guess. But I think the takeaway here, and the reason why, because I took this out and I put it back in, but a takeaway here is just that you see sort of the hazards and what are the human spaceflight risks that are associated with those hazards. So for instance, the distance from Earth is really going to limit the capability that we have to provide food for the crew. So that is a risk. There's a food and nutrition risk that we work on to ensure that we get as ready as we can to support the crew in these future missions. And so when we think about each of these human health and performance risks relative to the missions that we're supporting now and getting ready to support, there's a risk posture that we have. So you see in low Earth orbit with ISS, a lot of the work has been done. We've been able to address issues that first existed in prolonged missions, like with weightlessness and changes in muscle and bone. That used to be a a heavy risk for NASA, but research and medical efforts showed that with specific exercise regimens and nutritional components, we could offset a lot of that. So we see now that that is a green risk when it comes to ISS. But a lot of these, when we get to Mars, we have a lot of work to do. And so I'll be talking about that and how that relates to resiliency. So the group that I sit in, human factors and behavioral performance, is really the psychology and human factors arm of the human research program. And the specific risks that we target are behavioral medicine risk, which is really about individual well-being and stress, and so a very relevant risk in this discussion. We also look for ways to help with issues related to sleep, circadian rhythms, and work overload, also team level cohesion and performance. And then on the human factors side, we have kind of human factors, human-centric design that we work on, and what we call impact of dynamic loads. So that's the impact at landing and launch, and how to, from a human factors perspective, protect the crew. So in thinking about, resiliency and psychological resiliency, and I'm sure many folks over the past few presentations have been talking about different definitions, and I think that's one of the things that we've revisited on occasion is, what's our working definition of resiliency? What's our construct of resiliency, especially as we support research efforts to understand threats to resiliency and ways to augment resiliency. And so even within our own literature, I was looking at some of the reviews that we've supported over the past few years. There's multiple working definitions, but there's one that really stuck out to me, and that we've been working with, that involves this two-armed approach of really the building into that endurance or sustainability when faced with stressors, and then recovering or bouncing back from acute stressors. So those are sort of two important facets. And so now I'm going to just step through some of the work that we're doing in research to help with supporting those angles with resiliency. So part of that is breaking it up a little bit more detail, the mission characteristics that are relevant to us from a psychological point of view, and a human factors point of view. So when we think about current operations on ISS, a lot of it's familiar to us at this point. That's not to say that there aren't stressors and aren't issues that we need to still work on, but for the most part, it's a well-oiled machine. We understand how to support missions of that duration and of that distance. And that distance to low Earth orbit and the familiar duration in our process to date has really helped us understand how we can facilitate crew resiliency. So there's things such as, primarily real-time communication between family, ground operations, and the crew on orbit. In fact, they can do things like FaceTime and talk in real time for the most part. We can send crew care packages for special occasions. There's evacuation options that exist. Windows for Earth viewing, which is this very special and meaningful activity to the crew. Large volume and private quarters. Now we are seeing some new issues that are kind of arising. So there's physiological issues that come up occasionally, and we're also from a psychological health point of view, we're now entering an era of mixed crews between commercial flyers and NASA astronauts, sort of working together on ISS, and kind of the potential team implications that are there from both a positive and potential risk point of view. So that's some work that we have going on. But a lot of what we're doing now is thinking about those near-term Artemis missions and sort of how those risks are going to play out, or those stressors will play out in this new type of mission. So we anticipate, again, these are going to be, at least in the near term, very compressed timeline-wise. That means high tempo, a lot of shifting schedules, overnight work. Recently coming to learn that there will be a potential loss of communication and a comm delay that exists. And it's within this threshold that we don't know much about, 6 to 14 seconds of comm delay with the ground. How impactful will that be? How frustrating could that be for the crew trying to work in conjunction with mission control or with their loved ones back home? Limited resupply, small volume. You see here there's multiple factors associated with those types of missions. And then, of course, when we talk about sort of those long duration exploration missions, particularly extended Artemis missions and Mars, Now we're talking really about unprecedented exposures of hazards, the duration, the distance, the galactic space radiation, which we see in rodent literature can affect the central nervous system and other aspects of human health. No resupply options, no options for evacuation, Earth out of view, and so just the dependency on virtual windows to look at what's going on back home. Very limited food and exercise options, and then of course a whole other day-night schedule that is on the Mars surface. They have a 24-hour, Mars will offer a 24-hour and 39-minute day, which could pose some risks. And then the duration of the distance will really force this highly autonomous crew to function together with less dependency on the ground. And so that's a whole new way of doing missions for us. And so what we attempt to do is to understand kind of NASA's needs, what the crew will be facing relative to what we know from the way we support missions now, and what's in the general literature. And we pull that together and we kind of identify where are those gaps, again, those gaps in knowledge and gaps in mitigation that we need to conduct research to address these issues and fill those gaps and try to equip the crew of these future missions as much as we can. And so we use multiple research platforms to conduct studies. I kept the Sirius facility, which is with our Russian partners, the isolation facility over there where we've been conducting studies, but as can be expected, future studies are sort of on hold right now. But we do have some research coming out of there and a history, a good partnership with them that we'll talk a little bit about. But each of these facilities offers a different characteristic that sort of helps us answer specific research questions. This facility in ESA, the DLR allows us to do bed rest studies and understand sort of head down tilt effects, and then NSRL is where there's radiation research with rodent studies. So in current spaceflight, I'm sure you've heard about different perspectives and things going on there. From a research perspective, we've over the years have supported studies on the ISS, and that's brought attention to issues that emerge. So, reduced sleep and how that can affect cognitive performance and some risks that might elevate. Fine motor changes that can appear during gravitational transitions. And evidence also of neurostructural changes, although those are not really linked to functional performance. We don't know if things that we see like fluid redistribution in the brain, that are there any implications from that? And so that's kind of an unknown. We know the crew come home healthy, they perform really well during their missions. So if there's a risk that's a clinical or meaningful risk there, it's yet to be discovered, but that is something we're taking a look at to understand a little bit more. We have seen indications of stress increases, and that is often tied to workload and just the high tempo missions that can occur. As you can see, things like unanticipated EVAs, those are the kinds of things, just like when we have a presentation to give and we get really nervous about that, that can elevate stress. But we know from astronaut journals and other efforts that really it's an incredibly positive experience, and the crews are very high performing, and they really accomplish very successful missions. Different mitigations, again, that have been worked through are highlighted here. That includes schedule implications, schedule recommendations whenever they're recovering from things like an overnight shift. There's processes and rules in place to try to restore back things like lost sleep and to try to offset chronic fatigue. There's environmental countermeasures like smart lighting to help the crew get more of a day-night cycle. There's a lot of social support that happens. There's, you hear about the plant systems and the diversity in the current food system, exercise, and the psychological support from a great team on the ground that offers conferences every other week for them and is available on an as-needed basis to help the crew if there's issues that emerge. So now we think, again, back to Artemis. So this is where our research now is really focused. And so some differences, again, is going to be things like the delayed communication, the small volume. This is really changing how we are looking at how we need to support the crews. And so in those research platforms that I had shown you just a bit ago, I'll share a little bit more specifically about some of the findings that we've had in the past couple of years. But this is the Human Exploration Research Analog. If you heard Dr. Whiting's talk yesterday, she talked more at length about analogs, and her team really does an amazing job at implementing, kind of taking the science questions that we bring forward and that our researchers bring forward and implementing them in an operational setting. And so the HERA is a facility that allows us to run 4 45-day missions per year. And we can, we work to ensure that high fidelity environment, high fidelity mission, crew composition, and then that's where we can manipulate some experimental variables, have some control a little bit more than doing like a field study, and measure outcomes. And so a couple of fairly recent publications are highlighted here. And both of these really were aiming to measure performance over time in isolation and confinement. So what you see first is this individual task performance over extended mission duration in HERA. This was work led by Dr. Kevin Duda from Draper Laboratories and his team. And they have a high fidelity simulator that they developed many years ago. And what they found was that the crew took this, performed on the simulator over time, and there was a training aspect to kind of get the training aspect plateaued, and then performed it during the mission. And what we saw was improvement, and then a peak that occurs, and then a decline over time. And so so that is kind of the things that we're interested in when we think about these long duration missions. What are potential effects to performance? And so in this study, with this measure in this context, we saw a decline in performance over time at an individual level. Similarly, in a team study led by Dr. Leslie DeChurch, we evaluated, she and her team, Dr. DeChurch and her team, evaluated more of these team performance tasks. So it's really groups of people working together, and they've been living together just like they do in spaceflight. And across several different time points in a mission, they are performing together on a particular activity. And what we see is in the more complex aspects of team performance, such as creativity, problem solving, and decision making, which are the 3 facets of complex team performance that the investigators were looking at. Some interesting temporal changes, but for the most part, we can say, and on all 3 of these, I realize I only fit 2 up here, on all 3 of these, we see performance that is high at the beginning, and by the end of the mission, it's reduced. And so that is another indication of a potential effect of just duration, and kind of gives us some visibility into what do we need to focus on, how can we help the crew remain resilient over a period of, in these instances, it was 30 to 45 days, similar to what we expect for Artemis missions, but as we look ahead to Mars, that will be critically important. In HERA, sorry, this is another heavy content, and I apologize for that, but I just wanted to highlight this as to show you that we are really trying to think about how to operationalize some of these constructs in an experimental setting, so that they're meaningful and generalizable to future spaceflight. And so one of our targets this past year for our HERA research was understanding more fully this concept of autonomy, of being increasingly autonomous as the crew are further and further from home. And so the team worked to define, how do you operationalize increased autonomy? So one way is to instill a communication delay, because that communication delay with mission control and with loved ones back home kind of forces a natural break in that dependency. But there's other things, such as who's managing the workload, who's managing the timelines and the schedules. And so all that has been worked into the HERA facility. There's been other changes as well over the years, such as the removal of private quarters, because we know when they're in an Orion vehicle or in a small vehicle, accommodations for privacy will be a lot more limited. So really increasing that fidelity to spaceflight. And then just the clutter. I think the first couple of years of Hera was relatively open and luxurious. And so so there was a desire there to kind of make it that more constrained. And so in this setting, we can test things that, are these, so we've detected that there's threats to performance, threats to that ability to sort of endure, right, the chronic stressors. And so we test things like, okay, how can we augment the system design to better support the crew and not really be an additional stressor, which tends to happen a lot of times in system design. So there's a lot of effort there within Hera to understand how to best design virtual assistants, multimodal information systems, and look at how that can augment performance. If we introduce things like augmented reality or virtual reality, how can we do it in such a way that we're not overloading a crew member with information and it's really useful to them? So there's measures being looked at there. And then looking ahead, as we're getting ready to do our next year of Hera, we thought, okay, some of these Artemis risks now that we're trying to understand and buy down, let's see how we can change that environment within Hera, that experimental environment, to make it more meaningful to some of our near-term questions. So the comm delay I was just telling you about that we're doing in Hera now is 5 minutes across the mission. But we know, again, that lunar will be closer to 6 to 14 seconds. So we're thinking about weaving that in coming into Hera to really help address some of these near-term questions. What about off-nominal situations, troubleshooting in the context of something like a medical emergency? How do these virtual aids and multimodal information systems help then? So that's some of the work that we're weaving in. And we are also looking at different modes of communication for things like family support. And you may have heard, this is not something that HRP initiated, but there was a teleportation demonstration done recently from Dr. Joe Schmidt, who's a flight surgeon at NASA, where they beamed an image of him and in this interactive point of view with the crew. So really cool technology demonstration that kind of gets us thinking ahead for the future. But questions exist, right? So is that visual interaction going to be preferred over audio, or maybe in what situations would we prefer something like that? Does it perhaps elevate risk in other ways that we need to be concerned about? And so again, we've been recently targeting lunar, but as mentioned, Mars is really what we're ultimate end goal, I think, for HRP. And so these last few slides, I'll just highlight a couple of things relative to resiliency for Mars. So that mission is really going to be a whole new ball game for us. We're talking about potentially a 2.5-year mission in a very closed vehicle, small volume again. Now it's a 19-minute one-way comm delay. We have that Mars Soul, and we probably have things like periods of monotony that we will not really see in these near-term short-duration missions. So some of the work that we've supported is hopefully helping us understand things like, okay, so if we think about supporting crews for these missions, right, it's supporting their sleep, supporting them to be resilient with things like sleep, nutrition, exercise options, social support, right? And all these things are going to take a hit when we think about Mars. And so there was an effort a few years ago led by Dr. Takia Sermons and Grace Douglas looking at meal replacement bars and how do people do with a meal replacement bar over an extended period of time, because we cannot facilitate the same food system that we have on ISS in these future missions. We just don't have the volume to do that. But is there a risk in asking the crew to consume a meal replacement bar repeatedly for these missions? And so in a study that they led up in Hera, we saw that the meal replacement bars that were tested here that had the nutritional components that would be needed and that had been tested for taste and acceptability, over time, many of the crew quit eating them. And so we saw weight loss, and we saw an association too with decreased mood ratings on days that they had meal replacement bars. We see from other studies, there's an extended duration study that occurred many years ago, a drop in just natural activity levels. Sadly, I can relate to that. I've been blaming COVID for my lack of exercise and activity, but I'm thinking probably need to drop that excuse over the past year. But I think that was something that was very eye-opening in the sense of during those quarantine days, I think many folks can relate to that, just that general reduction in activity, reduction in social connection, and how that sort of creates a momentum in a way down that same path. So these are some of the things that we've been looking at that we kind of walked out during COVID times. We sponsored research in winter overs in Antarctica. And as I mentioned before, those neurostructural changes that have been seen on orbit, there have been some found in isolation studies in extended winter overs in Antarctica as well. Dr. Alexander Stahn saw reductions in hippocampal volume of the dentate gyrus and saw associations with BDNF concentrations as well. So suggesting the potential down the road for spaceflight environment, fluid shifts that happen in altered gravity that affect brain structure, and now we're adding prolonged isolation and confinement in the future. There's a potential augmented or synergistic risk that we have to think about and get ready for. And then we've seen also in other isolation studies, especially extended duration, declines in emotion recognition and emotion regulation. So Dr. Alfano in a long duration Antarctic study found a dampening, not so much an increase in negative affect, but a dampening of positive affect and a decline in self-regulation over time. 60-day head down tilt studies have showed a slowing in emotion recognition with a bias towards more negative emotion over time. And those types of studies are inherently isolating. And we also see, in things like when you add things like a total sleep deprivation, that sort of exacerbates the problem. And another isolation study showing one crew member, this was in a 520-day isolation study that our friends in Russia held at the IBNP facility. We see that one crew member with increased depression symptoms over time. So something for us to just be thinking about. But having stepped through all this, of course, there are limitations to analog research that we always have to keep in mind, including how generalizable are the crew in these missions to astronauts. But that's why it's just important to have a large portfolio as much as we can. And just noting back to the potential for combined stressors and synergistic effects, with Mars, we have this increase in space radiation, which is something that is difficult to study, as you can imagine, right? We know IRB will allow us to do that. We can't radiate the crew, so that's where there's a body of rodent research there that helps us understand the potential there for risks. And we do see effects on the central nervous system and cognitive function. A few examples, though, when we take combined stressors in anticipation of a Mars mission, and so what we see from Dr. Vivian Mao and colleagues, when they included a hind limb unloading protocol, which is kind of an analog for altered gravity. You get a fluid shift there that's similar to weightlessness, plus radiation, and you do a combination of both. You look down the road, and there's a decrease in aquaporin 4, which is a marker of blood-brain barrier permeability. So it speaks to that potential for a synergistic effect that we might not even, understand at this point. Similar recent work from Dr. Britton shows under conditions of radiation exposure, when there's sleep fragmentation, you get a synergistic effect. You get decrements that are exacerbated with that combination. So in conclusion, the implications for this research really has us thinking about how are we going to support the crew? What mitigations do we need to target given the constraints of a Mars mission when we think about the importance of social support towards resiliency, communication back home, food options, exercise, that connection to Earth? How can we do that? How can we facilitate that? What research and technology development needs to come forward for us to support the crew? And so this is where we have research going forward to try to understand that more fully. And if you're interested in learning more, just wanted to include a couple of links there. And I think that's it. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Whitmire. It's really fascinating, and I highly recommend people to visit those links that you put up there, because I've done it plenty of times, and going down those rabbit holes of just reading. It's incredibly informative and just interesting stuff. I'm going to throw it to you, Mitch, in a second. I'm just going to ask Sandra one question. I want to make sure you have time as well, Mitch. We There's just so much that can
Yeah.
happen and can go wrong. And I know I read it somewhere in one of the studies you're doing, and just and I don't know, like it's not meant to be silly, but two things always pop out of my mind: not having private space on those long duration. And I said yesterday, imagine if it was the three of us, I think we'd get along pretty well. But eventually, you're bound to get on each other's nerves. And I'm laughing as I say this. The only place, and because we heard about Hera yesterday, the analog, the only place to go get private time, I think, is the bathroom. Which I laughed at. I go because, well, that's not really surprising because many of us here on Earth, to get away from sometimes our family, will go to the bathroom, which I wonder if that's measured or even observed. Anyway, the other thing, which I'm just the little things, and I know I read it somewhere, if somebody has a toothache and they're on their way to Mars, what do you do? And it's how you have to anticipate everything. And I know it is from some of the talks that I've heard Mitch talk about that idea of some people, quoting Mitch from a previous training, he said, some people get frozen by change, woe is me. And then he said, I love change. I see it as there being a way through it. So my only question that I will ask you, Sandra, is when you had that slide up there, creativity, problem solving, decision making, completely biased, but I love how all research shows that enhances each of those things. And forgetting
Mm.
about that, my question to you is your vast experiences, everything that you're doing is pretty awesome. Can you just share one very short story of a moment where you felt awe in the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's a really great question. You know, the recent Artemis mission, the recent launch, I have to say, I personally have absolutely nothing to do with that with that mission. It's this incredible team of engineers across NASA and their partners that have made that possible. I think that launch, that successful launch and landing, it is absolutely awe-inspiring because it starts to give a reality to this research role that we've been in, right? And we've been talking about these future missions for years and trying to gear up for them. And I think that launch and those beautiful images from Artemis 1 just really instilled in many of us that sense of awe that we are really working towards something that's going to happen, and we're going to see teams of people, and some of them, are at Johnson Space Center now. Some of the crew that are there now that are part of the Artemis astronaut group, they're going to walk that surface of the moon. They're going to walk these missions out, and it starts to, it's just a sense of meaningfulness to the work I think we've been trying to shepherd along. So, having nothing to do with that mission, I still felt a tie to it and an awe to it, and just very grateful to get to be connected to it in some way.
Well, right, and that idea is that finding meaning and purpose in life, and you're part of the organization. By the way, I just thought real quick for it's the holiday season, and now that COVID somewhat relaxed, you can start going to holidays. And I know Mitch or myself, you go to a holiday party, people ask, "What do you do?" And if people ask you, Sandra, one of your opening lines, you get to tell people you're involved in reducing risk for astronauts on trips to Mars, and not many people get to say that. Mitch, real quick, I'll introduce you to our group and why you're so awesome and fantastic, and I appreciate you being here. I recommend people Google his name, and you can see how awesome and successful he is. He's the chairman and CEO of Civil's North America. I've had the privilege of hearing him talk. He's given me the opportunity to have private conversations where I can pick his brain. A brilliant, compassionate man, and I'd love to hear some maybe takeaways you got from Sandra's talk, and maybe a question or two for her. So it's all yours, Mitch.
All right, maybe compassionate, not so brilliant. But anyway, I'm going to start with your last question, Jeff, and this will tie it together. So Jeff was kind enough to invite me to a leadership presentation to the NYPD at an extraordinary location, which we then copied. And I've been in my current role for a little over 4 years, been in the real estate industry for quite some time, but I had one of the finest moments of my career and my example of awe. So we set up a leadership high potential leadership program and invited 24 people from the organization from all walks of the business. And the day before, I'm not going to give every little detail so as not to embarrass the individual, one of the participants wrote to me. He said, I came here with my parents when I was 3. We lived in one room, slept on one mattress. My father shined shoes in a train station. My mother cleaned a bar. And here I am participating in a high potential program for a major public company. So there are all kinds of awe. And that for me is a moment and an email I'll never forget. And we all have the opportunities to do that. Sandra, I have to tell you, I have to thank you and congratulate you for presenting complicated information in which you at least left me with a page and a half of takeaways. And I can tell you, I'm terrible in science, but there are a couple of points that I was going to, Jeff, I'm going to do this stream of consciousness, if this is okay, for 5 minutes or so. The first reaction was, okay, the next person that walks in a room, I'm going to tell them about, Sandra, what you go through. I don't want to listen to your problems, but then you often go to the second and more realistic. And I've been in the professional service industry for quite some time, and that's an industry of people. And whether it's NASA scientists or doctors or lawyers or real estate professionals, there are a lot of the same issues. And particularly through the last several years, the components for being successful in this environment are, as a leader, are a high degree of resilience, a very high degree of empathy, and also an increased emphasis on listening. And Jeff has heard me say this before, and I use this as shorthand: CEO equals CLO, Chief Listening Officer. And the thing about adversity is it's never relative. If you break your wrist, you don't say, thank God I don't have cancer. If you're the parent who's struggling with one child and an illness with one parent, you don't look at the person who has 3 children and dealing with issues with 2 parents, which are all circumstances we've dealt with here. And you have to understand that it is just not relative, and you have to deal with the issues of the moment. And the empathy part today is extraordinarily important. I've talked to a number of people in leadership roles, and we have a common view. Not only is it taken more, one of the biggest challenges is the need for to support your senior professionals over the last 2-3 years in a way that you hadn't in quite some time. And you sort of have to figure out, how do you create the circumstances? How do you know for yourself to create that combination of resilience so that you can continue to remain empathetic? And Sandra, as you mentioned, everyone had different issues during COVID, whether exercise less, saw people less. It was really a moment in time to lead by, where leader was an interesting, it was and is a remaining period, interesting time, because leadership by example has never been more important, but it may be different kinds of leadership. It's right from the beginning, one of the things we did was we sat outside in the cold in ski jackets and had pizzas and sat 6 feet apart. I met people for walks on the beach. We played tennis. Jeff knows I still play basketball, but we had to wait till the vaccines came in before we resumed those kinds of activities. And it was this constant reminder, remember what was normal and the pleasure of what was normal, because every time you do it, it makes you feel good. The other part of that was notwithstanding leading by example. And another example, which was also sort of a joke, was the last two Christmases, a little less so this year. Leadership by example was advertising that you were going away and that you were disconnecting and sending a message to the other people in the organization. And, you know, certainly for those of us who grew up, you know, that you were always connected, you know, so the last thing you did was advertise any vacation you took, but that was very important to let people know that it was okay to do that. And I think probably the last point, and Jeff and I'll now turn it over, is we deal very much with the question of returning to the office and what are the implications of not being in the office. Probably each of us have dealt with it in different ways. And, you know, one of the points that my colleagues and I make, look, if it's been so wonderful, why are we experiencing the worst and broadest degree of mental health issues that we ever had in our careers? And I hope that some of those studies you've done on isolation will get broader distribution, because there's a negative inertia that's developed not to commute, but very much offset by the implications of sitting in a room by yourself, regardless of your family. So with that, that's okay, Jeff. I'll turn it over to any questions or chat.
Well, I think because we only have a couple of minutes left, tying with what you just said there, Mitch, I get a question that I have for you, Sandra, and I know the research is vast and it's constantly going, but is there something that jumps off at the top of your head of maybe a takeaway regarding what Mitch just said about the isolation that not only is applicable for the future astronaut missions, but for the everyday listener here and when they watch the recording, that they can adapt and apply to their lives?
Yeah, thanks. And gosh, I just so appreciate this conversation, and what you and Mitch have shared is so powerful. I'm just regretting that I talk so much because I'd love to talk more with you guys, hear more your perspectives. You know, the point that Mitch just made about that return to office, I've struggled with that. I've found, so I think one thing that we see in the literature is we are not great gauges of our own needs, especially when we're, you know, sleep deprived. There's a lot of literature showing we just don't do a good job of self-evaluation. And one of the things I've noticed about myself in the context of what Mitch was talking about is that inertia, that's the word I was looking for earlier, of being home and being alone, and kind of justifying to myself that I could continue to do that. And so knowing the literature, having all the knowledge there, not all the knowledge, but having the knowledge there to know better, right? But yet rationalizing to myself why I'm good to stay on my own. But we've had a return to work of 1 day a week. And I try to talk myself out of it every time, but then I go because I have to. And when I'm there, it's amazing. You know, I had the most amazing time with my colleagues yesterday, with my team and a couple of folks. We were just talking and just being together. And I was really emotional about it last night. I was like, I have just missed that so much. And it brought back such an excitement for the work that we're getting to do. And so I think, sorry, I've rambled, but I think that accountability to something beyond our own kind of gut feel about, you know, kind of what we try to rationalize or fool ourselves sometimes into thinking that we know what's best, but sometimes we need that objective accountability, whether it's an objective measure like we look at in the literature, or people around us to help take that step forward and engage in those behaviors that might be a little bit more difficult, but really for our benefit.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking with everything that you said, and I was looking over my notes as well, because I know, like Mitch, I try to the notes helps me remember stuff, and how complex it truly is, whether you're doing an analog preparing for a space mission or real life applications. When you talk about sleep, nutrition, and then behavioral health and mental health. They're so interconnected because, and it's not, you eat crap food, you feel like crap. You don't get a good night's sleep. You don't want to eat healthy. You don't want to work out. And then what do? Not want to talk to people. So a lot of times I look at it, it creates those downward spirals, but it's also, it can go in the other direction, upward spirals of trying to eat something healthy can make you feel better. Like you said, that nudge of going back to work and having a good time. I know there were a few questions there. I'm looking, a reminder, people, for those next sessions, don't wait to the very end because those are all really good questions, but we're basically out of time. I'm gonna, to wrap this up, Mitch, last statement or comment, and then we'll end it with you, Sandra. But before I turn it over to both of you, thank you for participating and being here. This was really, really fantastic. But Mitch, go ahead.
Yeah, Sandra, just on that last point, I so appreciate the candor because not everyone's brave enough to say that. But it just, and this relates to everyone, we found broadly, and again, this isn't my study, more anecdotal, the 50 pluses, they're coming back. The young, the ones just entering the workforce, they're coming back. But it's those who are in their sort of mid 30s, mid 40s, and they say, look, I can do my job from home. I don't need the training. But what they have forgotten is that's not their only job. Their job is to do for others what those did for them. Because it's not, you don't skip, when you're training those who are just entering a workforce, you're not going all the way up. It's those who have 10, 15 years more experience. So people need to be reminded of what their responsibility is, work-wise, civic-wise, and family-wise, and it's just not to do their task, because if that's all their leaders did, they wouldn't have gotten to where they were.
And Sandra?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes, Mitch, thank you for that. That was really powerful and convicting, but I appreciate it. It's like that hard truth that it needs to be said and needs to be shared, and so appreciate what you've shared there. Yeah, so I thank you so much for the opportunity to come share today and to talk with you guys. Again, I apologize for taking a lot of the time because this is just such a valuable discussion, and I've been inspired by what you guys have shared. I will say, when I applied for the position that I have, I did it as a joke. I never thought that they would actually call me back. I thought they were crazy. I kind of still sometimes think they are, but so if anybody's kind of thinking about those things and talks themselves out of it, just do it, because you could be completely not qualified and in over your head, but somehow get opportunity that comes your way. But yeah, so thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about resiliency and to learn from this great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And last thing I'll say in the last 10 seconds is what you just said there. That's what hope and optimism is. Believing in your own abilities, even if it also feels absurd.
Here's a quick explanation of awe, why it's important, and how it's connected to your overall resilience and well-being. First, here's a definition of awe. Awe is a complex emotion we experience with something or someone that is extraordinary and challenges our current thinking. Awe is primarily positive, and the vast research shows it can help us with feeling calmer, reduces our stress, promotes pro-social behaviors, gratitude, creative and critical thinking. It helps us find meaning and purpose in our lives, and it can make us feel more connected to others. Awe can be elicited in different ways, including in nature, space, the arts and music, spirituality, in the company of others, and through accomplishments, both ours and others. Awe can be a gateway to other resilience practices, too. The good thing about awe is it doesn't have to be complex or time-consuming. Research has shown it only takes a few moments. Oh, and let's be clear, awe can be experienced in those once-in-a-lifetime moments, like a trip to somewhere exotic or the birth of a child, but it certainly is not limited to those types of moments. If our mindset is open to experiencing awe, we can experience it in our daily lives at home and at work. It's all about perspective, and you control that. Awe moments are there if you make time for it. We all deserve to have positive mental health. That certainly includes you, and it's not selfish, it's smart.